to business.
When he drinks, he thinks.
That's the nectar of the gods, baby.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the #1 liquid-fueled, liquid-lubricated show on the interwebs. This is the Whiskey Musings Broadcast. And tonight is a very somber night. I can't even begin to describe what a tragedy like this, and even worse, a tragedy that has occurred twice within just a few weeks. Especially on the second one, dealing with children, being that children were the target, at least it appears so. It's indescribable to even imagine. To be a parent, and one of the things that kind of goes through your mind as a parent oftentimes, especially when your kids are starting to go out and do things on their own, say driving on their own, for an example, at 16, or even when 21, when they take off and they go, to their first alcohol drinking at 21 kind of thing. I know, like when I left for the service, whenever these big events in our lives happen, as a parent, you always hope that your children are going to come back. And realistically, the standard way that things are supposed to work is that your children are supposed to essentially witness your passing, not the other way around. And so whenever a child in particular is ripped from this world, especially in a situation like this, where it is completely random and senseless, there's a lot of hurt and a lot of anger. And, even with like a car accident or something like that, that's something that is completely unavoidable. And yet something like this, we get the feeling that maybe there was a way to avoid it. And unfortunately, the people on the left, and I'm just going to lump them all together because there's a bunch of them over there, but the people on the left and even some on the right do a knee-jerk reaction and try to make some sense out of something that is completely senseless. And this is extremely difficult to deal with because we all want to do something. We all want this kind of thing to completely go away if we can. And the sad part about that, honestly, is that we don't really have the capability of eliminating this 100%. And it's that feeling that you get of complete loss of control over something like this is the greatest fear, I think, of all parents, all people. And to sit there and to try and assign blame outside of the individual who performed the heinous act, or outside of the situation in terms of things like just accidents that are completely unavoidable. It's really a misconception of placing blame. And unfortunately, those on the left are extremely talented in taking events like these and trying to turn them into something either political or use them as a leverage to make a policy change that they've been trying to make. And the fact of the matter is that even with that policy change, there's no guarantee that that policy change is actually going to change anything. And as much as we may consider that and think about that, and our logic takes over and says, you know what, that really doesn't make any sense, we tend to respond in a emotional manner to where we just feel like we have to do something. Doesn't matter what it is necessarily, because of such a horrific event to have occurred. And especially when the mainstream media trots out the families and the photos of the victims and, really pulls at your emotional heartstrings. It tends to be an emotional response. And in reality, we need to look at this more from a logical perspective. We need to look at this in a rational way and not necessarily respond from our emotions, because that's when we get into situations where a Pandora's box, per se, is opened up. And I've got a bunch of things on this. But first, I want to tell you tonight's format's going to be a little different. Number one, I'm not going to do any of my affiliates or sponsors. I'm going to avoid the advertisement piece outside of, what I usually say at the end. And I also am avoiding or not doing my typical with the drinking tonight, because realistically, this is such a somber occasion that I feel anything that I do outside of discussing the stuff that I have for you tonight I would be remiss and generally insensitive to do so. So with that, I'm going to jump right in to my topic and to my discussion tonight. I hope you at least can understand where I'm coming from with this. I definitely want to say thank you for everyone who has joined. I appreciate you taking your time, of course, to come and watch what I have to offer. One of the things that the left does is they have made it it's a reaction. It's a common occurrence to grab on to something and turn it into really what it doesn't need to be. And one of the things, especially when it comes to certain issues, one of the things that they do a lot of is they try to get you to do an emotional response to something that honestly is, for most, I'm going to say all people in this world who don't understand the senseless violence, because that's exactly what this is. And they attempt to change language, push you in certain directions to get you to do something that you wouldn't normally do without the idea of the emotions. And this is honestly how a lot of our current policies, regardless of what they are throughout history, have come into play. They have been put into place because of emotional reactions to catastrophic events. Things like getting into, for an example, the Spanish-American War. It was very unpopular until the news media and everything were able to mobilize people into the battle and the idea of going to war in regards to specifically the ship that was blown up. How that ship got blown up is under question, but the fact that it did, it spurred the American people to get into the Spanish-American War. And I forget the name of the actual ship itself. When we got into, World War II, as an example, it was due to the fact that we started to gain images of horrendous things that were going on. And actually that was one of the first wars that took into account visual images rather than just word descriptions. So it tugged at the heartstrings. It got us to do an emotional reaction. And in that particular case, to join in a essentially what was a mostly European conflict, at least up until the point that Pearl Harbor got bombed. So one of the things that you'll see and you'll hear over the next several days, and it's already happened. I mean, Beto O'Rourke has already opened up. Biden's speech last night was focused on essentially groups and items that are not the cause of this. It's very interesting to see how the left, and by interesting, I mean, it's more sick and disgusting than like a good type of interest. That the left does is they grab onto it and they twist words. They make things, they try to assign blame to inanimate objects, to groups that have nothing to do with what's going on. And this is exactly what Biden did in his speech, where he called out things like assault weapons bans and the gun lobby. Now, I can tell you for a fact that not a single, and in particular, I'm sure they were focused on the NRA, the National Rifle Association, but in particular, there has not been a single perpetrator who has been a member of the National Rifle Association. It was, it's a common misconception to blame them for things that are occurring because they're an easy target. They, again, give an emotional response. And the same thing goes with the weapon of choice. In this particular case, and in the case of the Buffalo shooting, it happened to be the particular flavor of the month for the left in terms of the AR-15 platform. Now, I've done a show on this before. I've done it with gun control the last time that we had a tragic event occur, and the statistics are out there. Statistically speaking, these weapons are not used in the predominance, unlike what the left says. They are not used in the predominance of gun violence. In fact, handguns are by far the most common weapon used in gun violent and especially even mass shootings. And the reason being is because of the fact that, when you look at the AR platform or any rifle in that respect, when you look at either one of them, they're hard to conceal. They're hard, they're bulky, they're difficult to maneuver in enclosed spaces. Honestly, that is not what they were necessarily designed to do, unless, of course, you have been trained to utilize them. And it's a specific type that would be used for something like urban combat. It's usually something that has a shorter barrel. Most of the ones that you've seen that have been used are the standard hunting rifle kind with the longer barrel, the idea to go for longer distance shooting. And so one of the biggest challenges that you have is looking at those statistics and being able to separate yourself from the emotional and realize that even though this is potentially a, scary weapon, or at least one that's been sensationalized in Hollywood and television in particular, is to understand that this weapon has specific uses, and it's not one of these things to utilize in the scenario that is the best tool to gain the end means. So when they start using terms like assault weapon, what they are discussing is they're discussing and talking about a very scary looking black rifle. And honestly, I mean, I had to go, I wanted to take a look at this because when you use the term assault weapon, or even the term so-called assault weapons, they're using the term assault in a very incorrect way, because what they're using it for is they're using it to try and describe an adjective. There's absolutely no such weapon that exists anywhere. If they try to tell you that, they are lying. Okay. And the reason, and I'll show you the reason for that here in just a moment. But the term assault is actually a noun or a verb. It is not an adjective. Okay. And I got that here. I'll bring this up. Where is it? There it is. So here is from Merriam-Webster's website dictionary definition. And the very first definition of the term assault is in regards to a noun. And it's a violent physical or verbal attack. It's a military attack, usually involving direct combat with enemy forces, or it's a concentrated effort as to reach a goal or defeat an adversary. Then, as in terms of law, it's a threat or attempt to inflict offensive physical contact or bodily harm on a person. That puts a person in immediate danger or in apprehension of such harm or contact. I mean, these are very, very, dry definitions. But the point here is that as a noun, when you use it as a noun, it is to basically describe a physical action. As a verb, which is a little bit farther down here, it is, again, to make assault on or to attack violently, in the sense of, rape as an assault. The victim was sexually assaulted. The term assault is actually the verb, and the word sexually in that statement is the adjective. Now, if you'll notice, there is no other way to take this word. So the whole idea that that the word assault, when used in the context of an assault weapon to try and describe something, that is what an adjective does. Okay? That is an adjective term, and in the position of the sentence. So they're using a term, first of all, in terms of English, that it's not supposed to be used that way, according to Merriam-Webster and the definition of that term. The other thing is there is no such thing as a assault weapon when you're looking at the definition of that, because of the fact that there is no way to describe a particular assault weapon, because if you try to describe it in that fashion, you can pretty much describe anything. Okay. You can describe an assault knife. You can describe, an assault bat. You can assault all kinds of stuff. Okay. So the thing about it is that when the left and all of these people who are talking about this, they talk about assault weapons, what they are trying to define is something that is undefinable. And the definition is so vague that their hopes are that people aren't going to pay attention to that. And they're just going to allow you are just going to allow them to impose whatever restrictions they want on this. And we also know, contrary to popular belief, and Joe Biden kind of mentioned this in his speech last night, was that the assault weapons ban that he refers to from 1994, that assault weapons ban, which came in under the Clinton era, it was called the Brady Bill. that while it appeared that this ban per se stopped gun violence in terms of using assault weapons in gun violence, it actually didn't really change anything. And this is the first article. This was actually written in 2019. This is out of and I got to get the name right here, the Foundation for Economic Education. And if we take a look at this article, studies find no evidence that assault weapon bans reduce homicide rates. I popped this article up in one of my other episodes when we were talking about this. And the fact of the matter is gun buybacks, they don't work. In fact, assault weapons bans don't reduce actual homicide rates because of the fact that, again, the assault weapon or the so-called assault weapon is hardly used. They are targeting the wrong tool. And what's even worse is by targeting the tool and not the cause, they're going after the symptom and not the disease. It's sort of like taking cold medicine for your cold. The fact of the matter is that your cold is a virus. There is nothing that can stop a virus per se. And so you have to just sort of deal with the symptoms. And so taking things like NyQuil and that kind of stuff, that attacks the symptoms and not the actual disease itself, which is the virus. You just sort of have to let it run its course. If you talk to any self-respecting doctor, that's what they're going to tell you, that with certain viruses, you can't do anything about them. And you have to let them kind of run their course when you're infected. So in this particular case, the left is pushing to do essentially that. They want to treat the symptom, but not the actual disease. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of what I think the disease actually is here in just a minute. But it's not just stories like this that demonstrate that we have issues with the assault weapons not doing anything and the assault weapons ban itself not doing anything. The U.S. Department of Justice by itself did an assessment, and they came up with essentially the exact same thing. So this is the Department of Justice now that did an analysis based off of the 1994 assault weapons ban. And when it came and it expired, when it came out to the end and expired, they did an analysis to determine whether or not, first of all, did it have any effect? And second of all, is it possible that if we put it back in, would it even have an effect at that point? And I've put a link in the show notes. You can read through the whole thing, but the key point in this particular situation is this right here. So the potential consequences of reauthorizing the ban as is, and the ban, for those that don't remember, was that the ban itself had to deal with high capacity magazines and so-called assault weapons. And they were looking at things like the AR-15 platform, the AK-47 platform, several scary looking weapons that they determined in their very misguided wisdom as weapons of war. And they actually have some pictures and descriptions inside this piece if you wanted to take a look. And taking the capacity of the magazines down to just 10 rounds. And they found that through looking at all of the events that occurred during the period of the ban, that literally it didn't really do that much because of the fact, and they admit this in the beginning of this piece, that the assault weapons weren't really used in homicides anyway. So they say in 10.2.1 here, potential consequences of reauthorizing the ban as is. This is the statement. Should it be renewed, the ban might reduce gunshot victimizations. This effect is likely to be small at best and possibly too small for reliable measurement. A 5% reduction in gunshot victimizations is perhaps a reasonable upper bound estimate of the ban's potential impact, based on the only available estimate of gunshot victimizations resulting from attacks in which more than 10 shots were fired. But the actual impact is likely to be smaller and may not be fully realized for many years into the future. Okay? So the reality is that even Biden's own Department of Justice has done an analysis and determined that the assault weapons ban didn't really do much. Didn't really stop homicides that much. Didn't really do anything, to slow down. It was a negligible impact at best. And if you really want to think about it in terms of effectiveness of even gun laws in general, not just the assault weapon ban, but the gun laws in general, because what you're going to hear from the left is a lot of calls for universal background checks. And what they are talking about is not universal background checks. What they are talking about is creating a gun registry, meaning that every single firearm owner will have to report what they have, and likely, if it's something that maybe was manufactured before serial numbers were even a part, it might even need to be required to get a trackable serial number put on it. Which all of this is, again, coming back to the point of control. Because what they really want to do is they want to find out who's got what and where. And while this tragedy is the stepping stone to do that, it is going back to the whole idea about control. They want to know who's got what and where, and they want that person to be responsible for all of that. They want the manufacturers of guns to be responsible for the deaths of people. Okay. So if the question that I have with that is, somebody gets behind the wheel drunk and drives over somebody and kills them, do you go after the car manufacturer for that death, or do you go after the driver, who is the person who, through their lack of restraint, went and did this heinous act? And the challenge with that, of course, is that, okay, you could make the argument that, maybe if the car had a breathalyzer in order to allow it to start, would it have kept the driver from actually driving? Well, sure, you could make that argument. But now you're starting to get into the whole concept of personal privacy, personal responsibility. And again, they're trying to make this a nanny state. So what they're going to attempt to do over the next several weeks and potentially months is they're going to introduce things within Congress to try and limit people's access to firearms. Now, my state's already kind of done that. We passed our governor, under his emergency powers, went and passed a high capacity magazine restriction. And we'll see if that actually holds, because our state constitution does uphold the Second Amendment. So it's going to be interesting to see from that perspective. But I actually want to say that we should stop going after the symptom. We need to go after the actual disease. And what do I mean by that? Well, to be completely honest, I think that we are seeing and we have seen, especially over the course of the last 5 years, if not longer, with all of the riots, all of the attacks on police officers, the race baiting, all of these things, what we have been seeing is a degradation of our societal values. And this is where the gun violence, honestly, is starting to come from. Now, what I'm about to present is not a silver bullet, if you'll pardon the phrase. It is not the end all be all. That this is only what I believe is only part of the problem and not the entire problem. And it is also not the entire solution. However, it does beg the aspect of our society as a whole. We've taken things like, like religion out of schools. We've taken away personal responsibility. We've turned our society into a me. And we've made it to where society you don't get punished. You don't get the negative consequence over your actions. And I'm not talking necessarily about corporal punishment, although that is one aspect of this. But the fact of the matter is that when you take away the interaction, the personal interaction, and the consequences of someone's actions, and you make it to where the consequences are not worse than the actual act itself, you have a problem, because then there is no deterrency. There's no deterrent there to keep you from doing the act. Now, give me just a second. I got to figure out where I'm at here. Nope, not that one. Wait a minute. Nope. Okay. So one of the things that I think is a huge, huge mistake is the breakdown of the family unit. And to be completely honest, I think that has its roots both in religion, but it also deals with morality. It also deals with just basic human interaction and understanding how to properly interact with someone in a social setting. So I took a look and I found this chart. And although it is directly focused on mothers, the chart still conveys an interesting thing. And you'll notice that it starts in 1968, goes all the way up to 2020 from left to right. You'll also notice that the light blue, which makes up the predominant color in the bottom of the chart, is for two parents. The pink or orange part, the next one up, is mother only. The green is father only. And then at the top, is the gray part is no parent, meaning orphans and that kind of stuff. Now, if you take a look at the trend on this, you'll see that the two-parent household is actually declining over time. It took a huge hit from, say, 1970 all the way to about 96 or so, and has sort of flattened some. But the thing about it is that, realistically, what has changed in that time period from 1970 till about 1996, 2000, as to what's the reasoning for having two parents in the house going to mother only or father only. And you can take a closer look at these numbers. You can try and analyze them in any way, shape, or form that you want. But in my opinion, I look at it and I say not so much that a two-parent household is better. That's pretty much given science. They've done several studies where a two-parent household for children in particular is much better. But there's two things that happened during that time period. One happens to be in the 1970s. You had our last bout with high inflation, high interest rates. We had, you had the whole drive to put women back into the workforce. And so what you ended up with is both parents had to go work in order to maintain their standard of living. And we're dealing with that, or we're getting ready to start dealing with that here in the very near future. The other thing that we had during that time period also has to deal with the fact that divorce rates started going up. You started getting, and this is going to sound bad, but and I don't mean this in a negative fashion, but you started getting into the whole free love, freedom, women's feminist movement, all of these things where the decision to, a woman doesn't necessarily need to be in the home like you saw in the 1940s and 50s. You see that now, the whole idea of the perfect family unit, getting married, having kids, dad works, mom stays home, has started to break down. And this becomes, in terms of timing, it becomes more and more prevalent over time. Now, there's another chart that I want to show you here. And this one is dealing with America has become a nation of dual income working couples. And so what you have here is you have, starting in 1965, it's actually right around 68 is where this chart kind of starts. You have kind of an equal, or you have sort of an area where, 38% of the time was the husband was the only one working, and 2% of the time the wife was the only one working. Whereas, both spouses working was right around 47%. So you almost had a pretty close to what I would say would be like a 50-50 split here. Give or take some numbers, but a 50-50 split of where you had both parents working versus just a husband alone. The key here, though, is as you watch this go across from about 1968 all the way to 2010, you have a drop in the husband only working. The wife only working doesn't really change much, goes from 2% to 7%. But what you do see is you see the whole idea of both spouses working go from 47% all the way up to 66%. So now I don't want you to think that I'm bringing this up to disparage people who have to work. Both couples have to work in order to maintain their standard of living. That is not the point of this exercise. The point of this graph and the point of this is that I want to bring to your attention has to deal with the fact that where do the kids go during that time? If you think about what the kids are doing, and I'll admit, I grew up in, for the most part in the late 70s, early 80s. I graduated high school right around the change of the century into the 90 era. So, from that standpoint, I was in many cases a latchkey kid because I would come home from school on my own. I walked to and from school pretty much on my own. My parents would send me out as they were leaving for work. I would go to school. I'd come home. I'd do, homework or whatever that I wanted in the afternoon and watch a bunch of TV. The other thing you also have to realize is that when you look at this, there was a huge change in not only, television, which pretty much television and radio up until, roughly late 80s, television and radio were like the largest technology consumption for most people. We started to get the technological boom, and now all of a sudden in the 90s, 1994, 95 in particular, we started to get things like the internet. We started to get things like computers, cell phones, pagers. Technology took off in this time frame. And with it came a whole new world of interaction, social interaction, especially in the 2000s. Now, I can tell you that when my stepfather got his first beeper for work, it was one of the greatest things was the beeper. And hey, being able to, and this was in the late 80s. So, it was cool to be able to, page somebody and have them call you back. But that begot the cell phone, and that begot the, the personal devices like the Blackberries, and moved into merging cell phones and Blackberries. And now all of a sudden you have this device that is attached to you 24/7. And what's even worse is the fact that not only is it attached to you 24/7, but it also has access to a huge, huge Wild West called the internet. Most parents today don't know how to lock down their kids' devices. And even then, most of the kids figure out how to circumvent any security mechanisms that have been added on. And so what does that do for you? Well, believe it or not, it opens up a whole world to a bunch of different things. And one of the challenges that you have with this is you have kids that are now trying to entertain themselves, not only in the case of social media, but also with online gaming. And I'm not blaming games specifically, but what I am saying is that there is a relative disconnect between the individual and their interactions online because of the anonymous value that you have. See, I can go online and I can create a profile, any kind of profile that I want. And as that profile, I can interact with hundreds, thousands, millions of people and not have any repercussions, unlike what I would have had I been standing in front of that person. Because to be honest with you, I mean, even as a kid, there were times where I wanted to say stuff to someone, but I wouldn't do it because you never knew how that person would react. The interactions that we have online now, through email, through Snapchat, through Instagram, through, Facebook, Twitter, all of them. We all have said the keyboard warriors are the ones that are out there. And I've been attacked online before. Now, I don't care. It doesn't make any difference to me because I grew up in an era where, believe it or not, the phrase sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me was a common thing. Okay. And when you look at people and especially parents, when you look at parents and the internal focus of themselves and their own self-satisfaction, just do me a favor, go into a restaurant. Doesn't matter what restaurant it is. If you can go into a restaurant, just take a look around and take a look around at how the kids are entertaining themselves and how the parents are being entertained. I can almost guarantee you just about everybody will have an electronic device in their hand. Now, am I saying electronic devices themselves are evil? No. Just like no one can say that guns by themselves are evil. It is the judicious use of their capabilities is where the issue comes into play. If you don't limit the amount of exposure that your children have, or put restrictions on how that works, they can go anywhere and do anything. Porn is prevalent everywhere. And porn teaches boys in particular to objectify the women. And also there is some really nasty stuff that you can find in just a regular average site. And it's not even blocked. If anybody really wants to, it's extremely disturbing to even think about. And I know that there are ways to block it, but most people are not technically savvy. At least the parents are not technically savvy enough to be able to block these certain items. And it's the same with the radicalization websites or the hate websites or whatever. And when you start getting into online bullying as a methodology of communication for the people who are online and the kids that are online, believe me, peer pressure is absolutely horrible. You get one person who says one negative thing, and then next thing you know, the rest of them are all able to jump online, and they can do it at 3:00 in the morning, and your kid won't see it until later on that night or whatever. The point is that they can do a drive-by and they can drop this off. Now, you couple that with the idea that you have an inability, because of the fact that you've been given participation trophies, and you have a difficult time as a individual to handle and process disappointment and bullying by itself. And I really, really, really need you to understand, I am not condoning bullying. At the same time, though, the only way for us to be able to stand up to bullying is to learn how to deal with bullying. And if you take away the concept of having to deal with the bullying, you get to a certain point where now all of a sudden your reactions are from a reactionary standpoint, your reactions are even worse. Dan Bongino kind of was talking about this on his episode today, and he was kind of saying how, the fathers in the family, the fathers in the home, they're the ones that, teach the kids, whether it's boys or girls, they teach the kids that roughhousing doesn't necessarily have to escalate into, severe injury or even death. And that, and I know I did this with my son. I mean, my son, I was throwing him up in the air and catching him, and he actually loved it. My daughter, she enjoyed it, but not as much. But the point is that when you get together and you wrestle around with the kids, whether they're boys or girls, and they attack you, I mean, we had so much fun times of running around and grabbing kids and, tickle fights and that kind of stuff. And you go through that process and understand that moms are usually the nurturing side. They're the ones that don't necessarily do those things. In fact, my wife, when the first time I threw my son up, she freaked at first. She was like, "Oh my God, you're going to hurt him." And the reality of it is that the interaction, and this has been proven through scientific studies, that the interaction of both a father and a mother sets the child up. And the key here is it has to be personal interaction from the father and the mother both to set the child up for success. There was I did an episode on fatherhood not too long ago, and let me just hop back here real quick, and it's episode 57 if you're interested to go and take a look. But I did an episode on fatherhood, and I played this video because Denzel Washington was doing an interview. It was a promotional interview for his movie, and I'm sorry, the name escapes me. It's behind him in the video. But it's a interview where he talks about his time growing up and the importance that he places on the fathers. So I want you to kind of take a listen to this. Let me get over to that screen. And I want you to take a listen to this and see, really listen to the words that he's talking about. In particular, he's focused on, the African Americans, the black plight. But in reality, I just want you to think about anyone. It doesn't matter who it is. So take a listen.
Think we've made any headway in the
I think it's more important to make headway in our own house. By the time the system comes into play, the damage is done. They're not locking up 7-year-olds.
Yeah.
I was in Chicago a couple of 3-4 weeks ago, and we saw these little kids on bikes with masks on the side of their head, like 5 or 6 of them. And the driver said, "Yeah, they're little yummies." I said, "Who?" He said, "Little yummies. Look up, Google Little Yummy." Little Yummy was an 11-year-old murderer.
Wow.
And you look at his picture, you'll see the headshot of him, and he's like this. And he got murdered at 11 by a 14-year-old.
Wow.
Who's doing life now, and a 16-year-old.
That makes no sense.
You blame the system? Where was his father? It starts in the house. It starts in the home. And yeah, well, my father got locked up. Well, where was his father?
Yeah.
You know, like I did talk about my 3 closest friends, and they did, 15 to 25. One did 28, this and that. I was the only one of the 3 that had a father in my life, even though my parents were together. But I still had a father who was a gentle man and a good example, and they didn't. We can blame the system if we want, but they didn't lock any of us up at 7.
Yeah.
We were all doing enough to get locked up at 13. My parents sent me in another direction. They didn't have anybody to help them, and they kept doing what they was doing, and the system got them. So I don't, the system is rigged, but why, all the more reason not to help it.
Now, that is an incredible piece of conversation right there, because of the fact that you're dealing with essentially a conversation about the social ineptitude of society today. And we all know it exists. We all know it's there. But it's the responsibility of the parents to set the kids up for success. And it's the responsibility of the parents who brought that child into the world to teach it right from wrong, to teach it the way to handle things. And it's not going to be always perfect. But he brings up a good point. You need to basically ask, where were the parents? Where were the grandparents? Where were the people who were in this child's life to put down the ground rules, set up the boundaries, and hold them to them? I see so many parents these days that they set up the ground rules and the boundaries, and then they're like, oh, I just want to be your friend. I don't want to, tick them off because I want to be their friend. I want to be their buddy. No, that's not the point of the parents. Now, I'm not saying that is the solution, but that is something that we definitely need to take a look at as a part of the problem. It's a part of the disease and not just the symptom. The symptom, by the time these kids are doing what they're doing, whether they're acting out or not, it's already over. That's the symptom of the disease. And a lack of, morality, a moral compass that we put in, which I argue comes from a religious roots. I won't say it's necessarily you have to be involved in religion, but even a friend of mine and I have conversations about this because he's not a religious person per se, but his values, I've argued with him, have come from a place of religion. So he himself is not religious, but his standards, morals, and ethics have come from a religious base. And this is where we have a bit of a problem in this world about that. So how can we avoid this, since societal values are not going to happen and change overnight? How can we avoid some of this moving forward? And one of the things that that Dan Bongino brought up today, so I'm applauding to him, and you can check the link. I put it in there. But one of the organizations that we have that helps protect, in particular, targets and targeted individuals is the Secret Service. Now, the Secret Service did a couple of analyses on school attack plots. One of them, they were talking about protecting America's schools, like some of the things that they can do to basically harden the schools and that kind of stuff. But one paper that they put together, or one analysis that they put together, was averting the school violence before it happened. And so I want to show you this little excerpt here. And I'm going to have to find it. Give me just a second here. Okay, it should be this one. Okay. So one of the things that they found was, first of all, prevention and early intervention are paramount to keep these things from happening. So let's go ahead and put that out there. Okay. We need to try to prevent and use early intervention, because honestly, by the time it comes down to the point where the person has the weapon and is going to commit the crime, we've already lost. We're behind the power curve. That's a responsive that's reactive rather than proactive response. But one of the things that this analysis did was that they came out with the idea that students who plotted school attacks shared many similarities with students who actually perpetrated the school attacks. And in both of the studies I mentioned, they were able to bring out 5 individual points. And this is where we can start to help identify. And as you'll notice, there's a commonality here. And the first one is that all of the students who plotted as well as perpetrated were found to have histories of school discipline and contact with law enforcement. In other words, they knew, the people above knew about the attacks, or knew about the people who were perpetrating the attacks. And sorry, I'm trying to see if I can get my anyway, I was trying to get this little black dot over here taken care of. Whoops, this little black dot right there. But anyway, all right, moving on. So they knew about them. They knew about the attacks. They knew about the person doing the attack. They had interaction with them ahead of time. And the funny thing about it is, somebody might argue and say, well, that's their, it's personal privacy. Well, I hate to tell you this, but, sorry, but kids realistically are under control of their parents, and they really shouldn't have much in the way of personal privacy. I mean, I can tell you right now that when our kids got their, cell phones and stuff, we pretty much told them straight out. We're like, look, first of all, we're going to be following you on social media. But also, whenever asked, you will hand over your phone without argument. You will unlock it, and I will be able to take a look through it. To make sure that things are going right. Now, those were the rules in my household, but that doesn't necessarily make them right or wrong. But the key here, though, is that, parental involvement is the big one. And especially if you're dealing with a person who has had histories of school discipline and contact with law enforcement. Now, almost all of them experienced bullying or had mental health issues that were frequently involving depression and suicide. Okay. So bullying does play a key part in this. Mental health issues play a key part in all of this. But the thing about it is that it's how we set these kids up from an early age, how to handle these kinds of things. We also have a commonality of that they were intending to or committed suicide as part of the school attack. They were using drugs and alcohol at an early age and had been impacted by adverse childhood experiences. And what they say by that is substance abuse in the home, violence or abuse in their, personal life, parental incarceration. So one of the parents went to jail, or had some other mental health issue and was incarcerated, protected. Research from the CDC, they state, associates these types of ACEs with a range of health, social, and behavioral problems throughout life. So the key here that you need to take a look at this document, I highly encourage that you download it and read through the entire thing. But the key here is that, we have a very troubled individuals who did not get the help that they need. Now, in particular, with regards to this person who did the Texas shooting, they actually reached out on social media to a couple of people, one of which was a stranger. The other was somebody that knew them personally from going to school with them, and even questioned, like, dude, what do you have? He sent a picture of the 2 rifles that he had. And the response was, bro, what are you doing with those? And the guy responded back and says, don't worry about it. It's things like this that you can see these red flags. You can see the potential coming. And it's the ignorance or ignoring this stuff that becomes a bit of a problem. And we need to be able to, in terms of trying to avert some of these things, we need to become a little more proactive. We can't take the hands-off approach anymore. Again, it's not the weapon. It's not the gun. Because by the time they get to that point, they're already past several checks and balances that could have been implemented ahead of time, that could have diverted these situations. And I'm not looking for blame, but I am basically saying that, when you look at all of these attacks, and I do mean look at all of them, and you look at the interviews afterward and the conversations afterward and all of these things afterward, you'll note that people knew that it was coming. People knew something was off. People knew that these individuals had the propensity, not necessarily that they were going to, but they had the propensity to do so. And it's these types of people that we need to figure out how to embrace. And we can't necessarily just leave it to law enforcement, although there is a bit of a blame there because, again, to point out, they already had contact with law enforcement. So law enforcement already saw that these people were potential problems. And unfortunately, just reporting someone doesn't mean anything, which is actually pretty good from that standpoint. I mean, from a issue with regards to personal, personal accountability and safety wise, and private, that's a good thing. But they already had contact with these people. They were already called out on domestic disturbances. In fact, the individual who did Texas reportedly posted an Instagram post when he was having arguments with his mother before he went to go and live with his grandmother, whom he ultimately shot and is now in critical condition. What is the ultimate goal out of all of this? What is the end result? Well, I can tell you after 50 years, starting in 1970 and working all the way up through the crime bill and everything else, after 50 years of trying to pound our heads against the wall and blame the inanimate object, we have got to stop doing that. We are focusing on the symptom, not the disease. We have gotten away from several societal values, things that are making the problems that we see today. A lack of responsibility on the part of parents, a lack of accountability and holding those students accountable on the part of teachers, friends, etc. A lack of morality in terms of even the thought process of going and potentially killing innocent kids, as an example, is just absolutely horrible. I mean, I played, cops and robbers and cowboys and Indians and bad guys versus good guys, all those games when I was growing up. And they were, you shot people. I mean, we would shoot people with rubber bands. We'd shoot, cap guns at each other and stuff like that. But there was never any thought of actually going and doing it for real. And a lot of that had to deal with the fact that I personally think that a lot of that had to deal with the fact that it wasn't, the violent games or the violence of anything. we were brought up in a world where we understood the difference between what could actually hurt somebody and what didn't, and the right and wrong of it all. When you leave these kids to just fend for themselves and learn from the internet, as an example, there's none of those fences. There's none of those walls. There's none of that pushing a child in the right direction with energy, with the proper energy. That's the disease. The symptom is simply the fact that these people are doing these horrific acts. But the disease, and ultimately the cure, is to bring us out of our materialistic society and to start bringing ourselves back to not only the concepts of religion, but also the understanding of what those concepts actually mean. And that's my final Whiskey Musings thought. Thank you very much for joining. I do appreciate it. Do me a favor, if you haven't already, click subscribe. I would really enjoy more subscriptions. I enjoy the chat. I've been watching it over here as they've been going on over up and down. And, take a moment tonight. If you pray, take a moment and pray. Pray for the lives that are lost, and pray for our country, because we are really in a seriously bad situation. And regardless of what the leftists, and I'll even say it like the Democrats are even trying to propose, none of that is going to help. None of that is going to solve this issue. This is not an easily solvable problem. There are things that we can do to prevent them, but this is not an easily resolved case in point. It's going to take years. We'll see you next time on the Whiskey Musings broadcast. Good night, everybody.